right, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you are. It's my pleasure to welcome Ravi Dhar, the George Rogers Clark Professor of Management and Marketing and the Director of the Center for Consumer Insights at Yale, to the Arizona think tank for behavioral decision making. Ravi, it's a real pleasure. Ravi is not only a marketing professor, but also a professor of psychology at Yale, an expert in consumer behavior, having published in the top consumer and marketing outlets and beyond for many years, and importantly, translating that information to marketing strategy. His focus is on psychological principles of decision making, such as limited self-control of consumers, their cognitive limitations of information processing, and consumer preferences. Above all, he's also the advisor of two of our marketing faculty, Jennifer Savory and Anastasia Ghosh. So it's a real pleasure. And just for planning purposes, we will have a Q&A at the end. So if you also want to put questions into the chat or unmute yourself, raise your hand, then Jennifer Savory will moderate a Q&A session at the end of the talk. We have till 12:15 in total. Thank you so much, Ravi.
Thank you, Martin. Nice to be here. A real pleasure to join you guys and talk about, I was just saying that I was talking to executives for 3 hours this morning, so it's much more fun talking to academics, so you can feel more relaxed. And I'll talk about a project. By the way, feel free to stop me anytime in the middle. I think that's our style, unlike in psychology. So if anything's not clear, I'll also pause at a few places so you can ask questions, but interrupt, unmute yourself. We're a small group, so feel free to do that. So this project, first of all, is with two graduate students, Guy and Minju. And it started a couple of years ago when we were looking at the role of adaptation. How do people adapt to negative experiences? I'll explain what adaptation means so people are not familiar. And the focus was really on negative experiences, in part because it's hard to study negative experiences. And people generally looked at positive experiences and said, yeah, kind of that applies to the rest, that applies to negative too. So why is it sort of become relatively more common nowadays? And what do I mean by negative experiences? Let me give a few examples. So think about that. You're taking some flights, you're sitting in the middle seat, and then you might have another flight, connected flight after that, which is also, maybe in the middle seat, or maybe you were lucky enough to get upgraded, to the bulkhead or even to business class. And so that's the change in experience that you'll have. Another example of that might be, people watch streaming shows, which is a sequences of episodes I watch. And I kind of feel like, I'm not enjoying it as much. It's not particularly good, but I still keep watching because I want to see what the next one is, rather than skipping it and stopping and moving on to the next one. So series of streaming shows, this happens. And of course, for students, it might be a series of lectures. You're sitting in the lecture, not particularly fun or enjoyable, and you know that you have another lecture which could be more fun or more enjoyable, or just as not fun and just as not enjoyable. So whenever you have this series of experiences, the question we are interested in is really, how does it impact your current experience? So the focus is not on the combined experience, it's just on the current one. How is that influenced by any expectation that I have of what the next experience might be? Is it as bad or is it better? And we'll talk a little bit about if it's worse. So we'll be combining the three sort of ways of looking at it. So that sort of highlights the question that I'll be spending time on is, how is the current experience, that is negative on a feature impacted by subsequent experience? You'll notice I put in the word feature there, and the reason is that, you get into what does an experience mean, and our focus is what's changed in the two experiences, just the middle seat. So you're sitting in the middle seat on a flight, then you have a subsequent flight where you're in an aisle, bulkhead, or a business class, right? So we wanted to focus on the features that might be differences across the two experiences, because the two experiences can vary in many different ways. I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. How does that matter if it's a very different experience? Will the results hold or not? And those kinds of things. So Right. So here's the question that we started off with, like, this is something we often do in judgment decision making, is what do people think would happen? What are people's intuition around that? So we started with a simple intuition study. Mr. A and Mr. B are asked to watch 2 videos on YouTube. And they're currently watching the first video. It's displayed in low resolution, and watching it is an unpleasant experience, right? So that they set up the context of Mr. A and Mr. B are watching the same, if you like, unpleasant experience right now. What's the difference? The difference is Mr. A knows that the second video will also be displayed in low resolution and black and white, i.e. equally unpleasant. However, Mr. B knows that the second video will be displayed in high resolution and in full color, and watching it will be a more pleasant experience. So we're kind of setting up the stage for Mr. A and Mr. B undergoing the same experience right now, equally unpleasant, but there's a difference in what the next experience is going to be like. And the question they were asked was very simple. The question was the following: while they're watching the first video, who will find the video more unpleasant? Mr. A, who will later watch another video in low resolution and black and white, no difference. Mr. B, who will watch a video in high resolution and full color. What we find is really a big difference here in people's intuition, and I'll show you the data is the opposite of intuition. And so what you're looking at is people are finding that Mr. B, who will later watch in high resolution and in full color, there's a difference between only 18% of them will find it more unpleasant, right? So in other words, what you're seeing here is almost the opposite of the data, and we call this sort of anticipatory utility. And that gets into 2 theories that people often have here. And one theory is the anticipatory utility, which is Mr. B, who's going to watch this fun video later. They're anticipating that difference, and then sitting in the middle seat doesn't feel so bad, because I know in 2 or 3 hours I'll be sitting in the aisle or bulkhead or business class. So that's one kind of theory people have, which makes the opposite prediction, which is the hedonic contrast, right? If the next one is going to be sitting in an aisle or a business class, this is going to suck even more when I'm sitting in the middle seat. What we find in the intuition data is that people think about it much more in terms of anticipatory utility than in terms of hedonic contrast. And the kind of people have different theories to mind, and they rely on those theories, and you get that intuition data. So far, when I asked the question, like which one, how would it feel currently, it's asking for a point estimate, like, what does it feel like right now? But the question we are really interested in is not a point estimate, but the question is like adaptation. And so that gets into what is the definition of adaptation, what does it mean? And when you have an experience that unfolds over 2 hours or 2 days or even 10 minutes, sitting in a classroom, how does an adaptation happen over that 90 minutes of the lecture, if you like, or 3 hours of the flight? So point estimate in the intuition study doesn't quite get it, but it's really hard to ask people to draw a slope of something. And so overall, the question of interest is not what does it feel overall, unpleasant or pleasant, but how does that unfold over time? So the definition of adaptation really is sort of the affective intensity of something decreases over time, right? So the idea of the adaptation is the notion that pleasure diminishes over time. So you buy this new television, you buy a new pair of shoes. The first day you get it, it gives you a lot of joy, but over time the joy decreases. Similarly, if you're going to have some pleasant experience or even unpleasant experience, you live next to a noisy train station, then the first few days, it's really annoying. And the theory, at least, would be over time, you'll adapt to the noise and it won't bother you, right? So there's a lot of debate in the literature of adaptation. Do people adapt? Do people adapt differently to positive experiences? Do people adapt differently to negative experiences? And as I said at the beginning, really, it's not been studied very systematically as much as positive experiences. It's just hard to do it, hard to control in the lab, and you have all kinds of ethics committees that makes it very hard. So the studies that have looked at negative experiences often have done it through sort of surveys, which have its own limitations, and we can talk about that as we go along. So what do we know about adaptation? It's an interesting area that I haven't done much work in it. I've written one or two papers here, but I've always found the area very fascinating and interesting. One big area that I won't talk about today, but people might find interesting, where it's studied is a lot in happiness, right? Subjective happiness, the idea that what happens to people's happiness when they make money, when they get a new job, they get promoted, all kinds of things. And do we adapt to the baseline when you buy a new possession? So one of the drivers of the reason for studying this is people who work in subjective well-being or happiness really tie it to what are people's theories of happiness. Because if you have the wrong theory of adaptation, you might kind of do stuff that doesn't really make you happy over time, and it's often called the hedonic treadmill. But if you narrow it down, adaptation in the lab or in the small, adapting to a specific good as opposed to happiness or well-being overall, but specific product, your new television set or a new pair of shoes that you purchased. Here, what's being studied about adaptation is this idea that adaptation happens in part because your attention stops on the stimuli over time, right? So when you first got promoted, or first got, when got a job where you wanted to be, or got into a graduate school where you wanted to be, you were very happy, right? Because that got all your attention. And once you're in that school, now it's really not getting your attention. So attention has been a big part of the theory. And so focalism, which is Dan Gilbert and Tim Wilson have done a lot of work in this area, saying that adaptation really can explain why people's predictions are often different from their experiences on happiness, right? So if your team wins, recently we had an election in Virginia or in New Jersey for governors, and people right on the day of the election, the party who lost, the members of the party who lost would feel very dejected and disappointed. And if you ask them how long you would be unhappy or happy if your party won, they overestimate the number of days because it's very salient. But over time, as next week rolls around, you're back to watching Netflix or going out with your friends, and you're not thinking about who's the governor of your state necessarily. So that's the general idea of focalism having an impact on adaptation. The second piece that has the notion of attention is uncertainty. And this is an important piece because what it means is that when you understand something or you explain away something, it doesn't draw as much attention to you. When something is uncertain, then it stays in your mind. And as a result, it's harder to adapt to it. And this notion of uncertainty has been used by people like George Lowenstein to kind of look at this notion of why, if you have something, let's say you're suffering from some condition which is reversible or irreversible. And if it's reversible, even if there's a small chance your thing might go into remission and you have hope, that can make it hard to adapt because that makes it very salient what you have. But if it's seen as irreversible, then even if the condition in some ways is more unpleasant, it makes you less unhappy because you stop thinking about it, because you think I can't change it, and you think about other things in life that matter to you that might be good. So, and this is a very important part, because uncertainty sort of has a way of attracting your attention, which has a way of then reducing the rate of adaptation. And similarly, there's other work on sort of reducing adaptation is through interruption, right? So this notion of you're watching a television or streaming and you don't have any commercials on it, you keep laughing, over time. If you're watching a 45-minute show, and you kind of adapt to it, and it's not going to give you as much pleasure as opposed to if you had some interruption. So you built in some commercial break, like every 10 minutes, you take a 30-second break. It allows you to not adapt to the whole sitcom or adventure or whatever murder mystery you're watching, and adaptation would be far lower is the idea. So as a result, your overall happiness might vary. So all this literature, the reason I'm showing you this literature is because we're going to focus on this key element of attention, which is there's not a whole lot we understand about how people's attention moves away, the theories of mind wandering and other things. But the idea that people's attention on a stimulus changes over time is a critical one we'll draw upon, which is this idea that I'm sitting in a middle seat. As soon as you sit in the middle seat in a 3-hour flight, you don't constantly think about it that I'm sitting on a middle seat. And the question for us is, what might make you think a little bit more about that? That's the general question. So here's a theory, and then I'll pause at the theory if you have any questions or comments after I lay out the main proposition. So basically, just to remind you, I'm only interested in the first experience as it unfolds. How does it change based on people's expectations of the subsequent experience? Is it going to be more fun, or is it going to be more of the same? That's the setup right now. So people, we know that people are likely to compare their current experience with the subsequent ones, right? People generally make comparisons. That's sort of a fundamental process of evaluation, but people don't always make comparisons. When are they likely to make comparisons? When there are differences. When it's more of the same, then there's nothing really to compare. If I'm going to be sitting in the middle seat again, that's not going to be salient to me than if I'm going to be upgraded to aisle seat. So if a feature is negative for the current experience, the middle seat in this case, and positive for the subsequent one, attention is sustained on that feature. So this is a standard theory of attention, that attention is drawn to differences. And because attention is drawn, due to differences, and it's drawn on the feature that is different between now and present, it could be now and future, it could be now and past. We'll get into that towards the end of the talk. Yeah. And the sustained attention on something slows adaptation. So that's a theory of adaptation, is all about reduced attention over time, and something that sustains attention over time is going to reduce the adaptation. And as a result, if a feature is negative for the current experience and positive for the subsequent experience, people adapt to it at a slower rate during the current experience. So our predictions are really about rate of adaptation. And the prediction is that the rate of adaptation will slow down if you think I'm going to see something better, which is the opposite of the anticipatory utility that I showed you. The pattern is similar to contrast, but I'll show you this is neither contrast nor anticipatory utility, what's going on. So that leads to the main proposition: expecting the subsequent experience to be better on a feature that is compared for the current experience slows the rate of adaptation. Why does this happen? This happens because expecting a negative feature to be positive, or more positive should be the right way of framing it, sustains attention on that feature. So let me pause here and see if there's any comments, questions so far on the theory, on the predictions, adaptation.
I have a question. This is Martin Duvenberg in the economics department here. And I have a question about, you talk about this current experience, and you compare it to things going forward. But it occurs to me that the current experience could, I want to ask about the nature of the current experience. I mean, take a situation where, someone gets a bucket of water over, say, or over himself, right? That could be a pleasurable experience, or it could be a frustrating experience. Sometimes experiences are really frustrating when they have been less good than expected previously. Mm-hmm. So maybe I'll make the question like that. How are you? Suppose that the initial experience was frustrating, and that could happen for good or bad experiences, right? Sure. It's relative.
Right. So there are a couple
about that.
Yes, a couple of answers to your question. So in our studies, and we can talk more generally after the studies, in our studies, there are two aspects, which is the experience that they will be shown will be pre-tested to be negative, that they're unpleasant. And obviously, we are leveraging the idea of randomized control, which is across the two groups of people, only thing that will change is the nature of the second experience that they're witnessing. And otherwise, we are keeping the experience the same. And the pretest will show that people find them equally unpleasant in the two groups. And as a result, we are isolating it to what's changing in the subsequent experience. So, any other questions or comments?
Okay.
Ravi, are you making a different prediction than if this were a pleasant experience and there would be a future unpleasant experience on that same feature? Is this?
So I think our theory would make the same predictions. And so this really, one of the questions come back is why is the whole paper framed around negative experiences? And as I said earlier, they have not been studied as much. And it's been for many reasons. And the idea, that's where we started off. But we talk in the discussion of the paper that we don't expect differences in terms of, what would happen to the, in other words, there's a way to reduce the satiation, even with a pleasant experience, by highlighting, what's any change that's happening. We do a caveat, which is there might be some floor and ceiling effects for pleasant experiences. And so you may not get the same nice pattern, but the theory is very similar. We also, having not run those studies, we want to be careful and say that, are there other things that might overwhelm it? Like, so if there's a really negative thing that's happening that can just stress you out, for example, and that'll bring into account anticipatory utility. And it's like, that's going to have an impact on my current experience. So the short answer is we haven't tested it. The theory would make the same predictions, but see the caveats that if the predictions don't hold, there are other things that might be going on, right? So I think, so it's a good question, yeah.
Nicely framed.
All right, so go ahead.
I kind of had a sort of similar, if it's about attentional process, if my second experience is even worse than my first one, what would happen?
That we have data for, Nastya. I'll show you the data. So that will show the same pattern as a positive experience. And that's why I'm ruling out contrast effects as an explanation. So as to not lose the audience on that, when I come to that study, we can come back to that. Yeah. Great. So let me show you the first study, which is really 1A and 1B, which is, keep in mind, this is closer to the intuition study. In other words, it's not measuring the first experience in multiple points in time, but a single outcome, which in theory is not ideal way to measure adaptation, because it's measuring at a single point in time towards the end of the experience, but that's just a starting study. So let me show you, but the design follows, this study design follows all the other studies, the 1A, 1B. So 1A is, what is 1A? They're told you'll be watching 2 video clips, and they would be watching it in the format that you just see on my screen, like look, not the right format, but it's tilted like, in one direction. So it's unpleasant to watch. And they're told the next video clip you'll be watching will also be in the same format. Or in the other group, they're told they'll be watching in this format, right? So the word better and similar are not used. Those are just for you, but they're just told about the format is going to be like this one. And we know from the pre-testing that, I don't think we have the pre-testing data here, it's in the paper. We show that people think, obviously, this is unpleasant, and they think this is a better format, and that's not a pleasant format, right? All right, so the first study really looked at the data. This clip was for 180 seconds. And I think the measurement was taken at 160 seconds. So there's a single measurement taken, which, as I told you, is not the ideal way to measure adaptation. You used to take multiple measures, and we will do that in the subsequent studies, but this is just a starting point. And the question was really around a scale, like how pleasant is your viewing experience right now at the time of 160 seconds. And so here's what the data shows. There was basically, when they expected something better, their overall experience was less pleasant, which is consistent with the idea that you have not adapted to it. But obviously, we haven't measured adaptation yet. But the general idea is that that being more, something seems as more pleasant when it's similar means you've adapted to it more than in the other condition. Keep in mind, this is still measuring only the first video clip, which was identical across the 2 groups. So all it shows is the role of expectations on that. Second study, or study 1B, was the same design, same everything, except the deep in it measure changed in terms of not measuring how unpleasant or pleasant it's for you, but how likely are you to recommend it. So you can call it a little bit of a downstream implications, like what do people say, how much did they enjoy the video? And the short answer is same video clips, sideways or in the right format, measuring your scale. And again, the same results, which is people are less likely to recommend it when it's when they expect something better later on, right? So that's part of our theory. Yeah. So summarizing the results so far, expecting a subsequent experience to be positive on a feature can make current experience more unpleasant and reduce willingness to recommend it. Now we get to the theory, what is happening here? Evaluation through the experience. We haven't measured evaluation through the experience. I only showed you a point estimate of things. So now we'll start having multiple measures like at 20 seconds, 50 seconds, 150 seconds, and so forth. So you're going to measure and see what the slope looks like. Are the people adapting at a differential rate based on their expectation? That's one thing we'll do in the study. The second study would be to test an alternative explanation around hedonic contrast. Is your result essentially based on hedonic contrast, which is when people expect something better, that makes them feel worse right now? The data is consistent with that and not consistent with the intuition study, which we started off the paper. The intuition study, if you remember, was not about contrast, but people expect anticipatory utility. A couple of points I want to make here. The first is the contrast effect story. I don't really think it explains the finding of adaptation rates because it predicts almost a main effect, like it's an intercept effect, it's not a slope effect. Because what contrast says is like, when you start watching it, maybe you should like it less, and that thing will continue throughout the time period you watch them. Our prediction is more like this. So you see the difference, I'll play it again. It's like the slope changes, basically the rate of adaptation changes. So that's one explanation. And you might be going, yeah, I kind of buy it, but maybe not. So then it goes to Anastasia's point, which is what happens when it's, sorry, what did I do here? Yeah, when it's a similar one, we already talked about that. And when it's worse experience. So what happens when it's a worse experience? Now, according to the contrast effect, it should start looking better because it's something worse coming up. But our prediction is based on the attention sustained on the current experience. So our prediction is the worse will actually look very similar to better. So we don't now have many different cells, similar, worse, and better, to explain these findings. There is a complicated version of the contrast story that I can tell you a little bit about if you're interested, which is I said that contrast doesn't make a prediction of rate of change. It makes a prediction only about the intercept, main effect, if you like. There are complicated stories of contrast, which makes the opposite prediction on the slope side, which is as you're reaching the end of the first experience, the contrast should be larger because I can feel this is coming to an end. I'm sitting in the middle seat. I can salivate and feel how it feels about the business class or the aisle seat that I'm about to get. So that would predict not a main effect, but that would predict a slope in the opposite direction of what we find. And there's some work by George Lowenstein. I would put it in the storytelling mode more than data. Is this notion that, when people try to escape from the prison right before their term is almost over. So they're almost anticipating what the real outside world feels like, and they try to run away, which obviously is counterproductive because you end up spending a lot more time in prison. And again, there's not really good data on that, but what people have motivated use that story to motivate why the contrast effects can be higher at the end of the experience than the beginning. Neither of the two really explain the pattern the data will show you. So let me go to the data itself now. Again, the same setup, you'll watch 2 video clips. Right now you're watching in this sideways. In the similar condition, you'll keep watching the sideways. In the better condition, you'll watch it, in the right format. In the worst condition, now you're watching it upside down. Maybe if you're doing Yoda, you're in the perfect condition then in that, but that's probably a small group of people randomly assigned to both cells, so it doesn't matter. And the pretest showed, I think, all the data that relative to this was seen as more pleasant, and that was seen as more unpleasant by large number of people. So this was, so pre-tested to show that the experience became worse or better based on what the second video is. So now they were watching this for 250 seconds was the plan, and there were multiple measures here at 5, 120, 235. So right before, so everything is happening before the end of the experience, and that's important because endings can have its own effect. And a scale, very similar scale was used, pleasant to unpleasant. and they were writing this down. Yeah.
Ravi, they knew that the clip was 250?
Sorry, did they know the clip was
Did they
250?
know that? Did they know how close they were to the end in the last piece?
You know, it's a good question. I don't honestly remember from that. I would have to ask my co-authors. My sense is the timing, they certainly knew they were going to watch a second clip, but I'm not sure we told them how long each clip was, but I don't remember the answer to that now. Yeah. All right, so and this is the scale, and so these are 3 measures. And so this is what we find, for people who expect to watch the same, same pattern, if you like. So they're watching sideways now, they continue to watch sideways. Reminder that the contrast effect is predicting some kind of a main effect, but we are predicting reduced adaptation, which is change in slope. This is what our data looks like. For people who expect to watch a more positive video, their rate of adaptation is slower, if you like. And then the people in the red, which is people who are expecting to watch in the same format. And then finally, we have this interaction with the people who are expecting to watch it worse, which is top, upside down. So they look very similar if you look at the data to the people who were watching it. Worse and better data looks very similar and different from people who are going to watch in the same format. So just to summarize the study, expecting a subsequent experience that is either better or worse on a feature that is negative for the current experience makes the current experience more unpleasant by slowing the rate of adaptation, not due to a contrast effect. Study 3 takes a very similar design and create some uncertainty around the expectation. So, in practice, you don't know whether the next lecture is going to be really good or really bad, or it's going to be next seat. Maybe I don't know if I'm going to be getting upgraded. I'm hoping to get upgraded. So there's some uncertainty around what the next experience is going to be like. So what we did this is very similar to the earlier studies, except instead of saying it'll be a better experience, they were told it's possibly better experience. And we wanted to see, is uncertainty enough to draw the attention to the current experience and make you feel worse about it or reduce the rate of adaptation? So that's the general design here. They were watching this video, this clip, and then they were told they'd watch another TED Talk clip, but it would be in the better format, or in the same format. Here, the manipulation was black and white and grainy. It's not always being sideways, so there are other manipulations. And again, pre-test showed that when it's videos are black and white and grainy, people don't seem to like it. Here we had 3 measures, 300-second video at 10, 100, 190, 280. And you notice the data. Basically, again, the rate of adaptation is lower when you expect that the video will be in a more pleasant format. If you look at the data here in terms of, there is some adaptation going on, obviously, over time in both conditions, but it's the rate that's varying, and that's not unusual in these adaptation studies. Like, you don't get this whopping effects, if you like, but it's a very strongly statistically significant differences in slope that you find in these 2 conditions. Study 4 was really a test of the theory. So far, I told you the theory is really that it sustains attention on the first experience if the next one is changing, but we haven't showed you any evidence directly of that other than ruling out some studies. So what study 4 tried to do is really, added a condition where people were asked to sustain attention on the negative features. So there's a 3rd condition now, and we wanted to see what would the pattern of data look like for this 4th condition, if you like, the 3rd condition where people were told, pay attention to it. Sounds like a, somewhat silly manipulation, but it's often used in the literature on focalism to get people to sustain attention on that. So we borrowed it from that. So the 2 conditions you're already familiar with. Some people watching it sideways told the next one you'll also watch sideways, or you'll watch them vertically. Or a 3rd condition, focus on how it feels to watch a titled video, right? So put your attention on this, not titled, tilted video. So focus your attention on that as you're doing. And our predictions would be that the bottom two, better and focusing attention, would look very similar, because our theory is that's what's happening in the better condition, right? So that's the idea behind it. And that's what the data shows like. So if you look at the condition of focusing attention, it's almost scarily similar to the condition on which they were told it's better video. And the slopes are, the rate of adaptation is very different from the ones who were told you continue to watch sideways. So any question, maybe I'll pause here. Any comments or questions on the study so far? Anything I need to clarify? Okay. So the next study is really looking at whether the effect holds in a different sensory domain, right? These are experiences are usually multi-sensory. You know, we talked about the bucket earlier. Some people might find frustrating, some might find it thrilling. So we wanted to simplify here and look at another domain like the auditory domain. So sort of sound, you know, we know that some sounds can be very painful. And we wanted to look at a different domain than a visual domain processing. Secondly, we wanted to look at what happens when it's really even a very low chance of the feature being positive for a subsequent experience. So you had only 5% chance that the next experience would be, you know, you'd be upgraded to the aisle seat, you know. So even if it's very low, doesn't matter. And the reason we did this is really, you know, as background, the motivation of this project started off somewhere else, and then it sort of landed where we are. It started off with really this study, which is that this notion of people think of hope as being a good thing, you know, all about resilience and having hope. It makes you get through life. And we don't disagree with that. But hope can also have a negative experience, a negative impact. And anytime you have hope, even if it's very small, and I'm sure there's, you know, psychologists who study relationships must have looked at it, how people might stay in a bad relationship because they feel they can undo it or they can change certain aspects of it. I mentioned medical conditions that people don't adapt to that can make you unhappy. And so this whole notion of that even very small probabilities of having something positive can change adaptation is what we really wanted to study. And there was some study that was done, you know, in the literature. I forget if that's the Smith 2009 paper here that got me thinking, was this idea that if people have some colostomy that's reversible or not, and then how do they feel? The problem, of course, in that study is there's no control, there's no randomization, and people who have reversible colostomy have a different condition severity than people who have irreversible. You could do the study only with 10 people. So this notion that that small amount of hope can be counterproductive in certain domains is really what sort of motivated this project early on. But then we decided there's some broader points to be made on adaptation, and that's sort of what led to studies 1 and 4. I think we might have even started with study 5 in the beginning when the project started, which was really around the small probability events. How do people think about that? This is the sound. I was talking to the Benju and Guy, the PhD students who designed the study. They said, you know, I said, I wanted to listen to what it sounds like. I don't have an audio clip, but it's really annoying. It's like they created this unpleasant sounds, obviously pre-tested, you know. It's almost like scratching your nails on the wall kind of experience. And then the idea was you're listening to sounds, an unpleasant auditory thing. And there's a 5% chance it's going to get better in the next clip that you hear, or it's going to remain the same, right? So again, we are interested only in the first experience, and how does your adaptation to the first experience change based on expectation about the subsequent experience? That's always been the focus. Listen to the first sound, and it's really, you know, this scratchy sound that I mentioned to you. And then again, you're measured at, you know, 10, 120, 210 seconds. The clip is 230 seconds long. And you find the same differences in rate of adaptation. So people who expect to hear another one in the same way adapt faster than people who think I'm going to hear something better, even though the probability of being better is only around 5%. So that's sort of the idea that rate of adaptation depends on subsequent experiences, even if they're not likely to be better. So let me sort of conclude a little bit in terms of this study. Expecting a feature that is negative for a current experience to be positive can slow adaptation. We show this with both visual and auditory stimuli. Even when the feature is highly unlikely to be positive for the subsequent experience, only 5% chance, and the effect is driven by sustained attention. Okay. Here's an interesting, and here probably I would like to hear what you guys think. This was not written starting off with a marketing application kind of a paper. It really started off with the psychology of what's adaptation happening. And a natural question is what's an interesting implications of this? And I have a few right now that I'm going to go through, but I'd love to hear your thoughts if you think about framing it, because we haven't yet actually submitted this paper. It's in the process of being submitted. And one thing I was thinking, because a lot of these studies are obviously done in the lab with 200, 300 seconds, really hard to study adaptation over a long period of time, too many contaminations that you cannot control for. But you also obviously want to make some broader points, some of the things we're discussing. So one interesting idea I was thinking, when I was traveling in the airports or other places, I see signs like this, like when the airport is in a crappy situation, they say, hey, hold on, it's going to get better. We are renovating this thing, and within 3 months, 6 months, a year, it's going to look like a new airport. And I was wondering that one interesting implication could be just making it more salient, like how, and you're drawing the attention to the mess the airport is in, and you might make people's experience worse off by just putting the signs up. So well-intentioned reminders of future improvements sort of may be counterproductive, as in this case. So what should you be doing that makes it not counterproductive? So that's kind of one thing I was thinking about. The other thing is around upgrades. So when you buy a phone, you buy a new iPhone, and we know that successive generation comes out all the time. And the question with adaptation becomes like, when the new generation comes out, now I start thinking, oh, I have an old one. I have an iPhone 12 or 11, and the 13 just came out. And now it starts drawing my attention to the features. How does the company, if they want them to upgrade, how do they draw attention to certain aspects that might make you feel more dissatisfied with the current one, especially if you want people to upgrade? So I was thinking that the domain of upgrades might be another area in which thinking about adaptation might be useful, because we know that people procrastinate. You have this thing, you say, it's okay, should I upgrade to they have some features, but I have some other things, that I'm happy with. And that becomes an interesting area. So if you look at, I'm thinking out loud because I haven't thought through this yet, but you think about YouTube commercial free and Hulu commercial free, and most of us don't have YouTube commercial free. We still go through the commercials. I was talking to some senior executives. They hate those commercials. They say you can certainly afford to pay the $20 and get the commercial free, but a lot of us just don't bother, right? And so the question is, what should you be doing to make maybe the pleasant, somewhat current experience unpleasant, and a timely way to upgrade them, right? Right now, what they do is just annoys the hell out of people, but doesn't get them to upgrade, because there's not an easy way to upgrade right around that time. Is there a way to sort of draw attention to the dissatisfaction with the commercials you have, and then offer it in a way that is positive? So, again, the idea of, otherwise you just adapt to commercials, right? So I have adapted to commercials. We do this paper with undergraduate and PhD students on, interruptions or commercials in do they help or hurt? And it's very clear watching the undergraduates, they want to do nothing. They want to have nothing to do with commercials, right? They grew up in a world in which they don't see commercials like Netflix or other streaming, and it doesn't matter what the paper says, it'll make you happier. They say, no, I don't believe that, right? I mean, they have very strong intuition around that commercials reduce my overall happiness. So it raises a lot of interesting questions around people's own theories about adaptation and what impact does it have on whether or not people upgrade or not. Questions that often come up, and we'll come back, we'll go to the discussion. I'm almost done, see if you have any comments or questions, is really around the, in our studies, you had an experience and you had an experience right after that, or you anticipated that. Nobody watched the second experience or heard the second experience, but they were told you would have one. What if it's on a very different day, temporally separated? Does it matter? Does it also matter that they're not the same type? So in our design, you had a very similar experience. You're watching 2 tech talks, 2 songs, or 2, video content. What if one is a video content and the other is a pleasant experience of certain other type, very different? How much does it matter, the distance, both psychologically and temporally? And my sense is if they're very different experiences, people may not integrate that. It may not have an impact on your attention on if the first one is a middle seat and the next one is, oh, I'm in the middle seat, but I'm going to go for a nice dinner tonight, right? And I don't think that has the same effect in getting your attention on the middle seat. So I think it matters if it's a sequences of outcomes that are very similar as opposed to very different, but we have not tested that. Temporal one, what about if it's in the past? All of us are testing was in the future, like what happens in the next one? What if it's in the past, like you remind them of, hey, you watched another unpleasant video. Harder to test some of those things, how do you set it up? But does the retrospective have the same thing as prospective? My intuition tells me there will be differences. Some cases there are no differences. In our case, I think I wouldn't expect the same effect on sustaining attention based on, making something salient in memory, but I don't know the answer to that. We haven't tested that. So that's kind of another area that we thought about and might be in the discussion section. And I think that's the end of my slides. So I'm going to stop sharing. And happy to have a broader discussion on this or anything else on your mind related to judgment decision making as well. Yeah.
Ravi, I'll kick off, and then everyone else, please either feel free to unmute, feel free to share it. It's a small enough group. I'm happy to have people just sort of directly jump in. I want to start by saying thank you. Thank you so much for that really awesome presentation. Actually, Anastasia's teaching a JDM seminar and I'm teaching a methods seminar right now. And so those students are on the call. And I definitely was sort of hitting up my students during the call being like, oh, look, Ravi just did this thing that I've been trying to explain to you. So that was a really excellent demonstration of a lot of the work. So thank you so much. I guess my first question to you is whether...
Thank you.